I was not focused on maximizing revenue. I was focused on growing the audience and maximizing the audience.
So you sold for 15 million. What amount of that finally ends up with the founder in like these kind of situations?
A lot of people want to be entrepreneurs. And there's something to be said for gaining some life and work experience and industry experience as well before you launch your own business.
Without getting into like the weeds of it, like what's the big overarching reason you think you got fired?
You have to fail fast and you have to like pivot fast and move on fast. Never. I had no interest in selling the business.
You had no interest
interest in selling the business.
I was thinking that where we could sort of start the conversation is, and this is like, in like movies, you have like a flashback. And what I want to start with is what your recent LinkedIn post was. And for the people who are going to be watching this, I'm going to put the screenshot of your latest LinkedIn post. And that's going to sort of set the context for what we're going to be talking about for the next few hours.
Sorry, which LinkedIn post are you referring to?
I'm gonna. So these are your words. I'm gonna just say your words, okay? Today marked my last day with blogTO and Zoomer Media after a company decided to terminate my employment. It was a great 20-year run, and I'm proud of what we've built together. So you just got fired from the company that you started 20 years ago. And people don't know this about you, but there's a beautiful bookend story hidden underneath the surface where you actually started blogTO by getting fired. So, Tim, let's go back in time and talk about what is it that you were doing in 2004 that got you fired and got you excited about starting blogTO?
So yeah, some would say that this bookend is cute. And others may have different opinions. But yeah, the truth is that when I started blogTO, I had a full-time job. I was working for a advertising agency in Toronto at the time. It's called McLaren McCann. It's one of these agencies that did both traditional advertising as well as digital advertising. And I was on the digital advertising side. So I helped clients. In fact, my client at the time was Microsoft. I helped them with their online advertising in Canada. It was at that time that I started the site, and I just did it, evenings and weekends, whenever I could fit it in, right? And at some point around, maybe a year or less than a year after starting it, I moved to a new job. I moved to a company called Ogilvy. Again, another advertising agency, same sort of a deal. And at that point, I was still working on the digital side of the business. But I was where my client at that time was Yahoo. Yahoo, which at the time was still a very successful, well-regarded, one of the original .com, media companies, right? Still got a lot of traffic. A lot of people had it as their homepage. A lot of people had Yahoo email addresses. And it was during that time where blogTO really started to take off. And I had, just didn't have enough time in the day to do what I needed to support blogTO, as well as, do my job, at this agency. And I think they noticed it. I had my own office at the time. I guess I was kind of worked my way up where I had my own office, which had its, a door and, kind of soundproof and my private space. And so I would sit in there during the day, working on blogTO. And, still more or less getting my job done at work, but, I think I was starting to slip. So one day I was called into the office. The president of the business called me in. He said, "Hey, Tim," I can't remember exactly the words that he spoke to me, but he was basically, "Listen, we're going to, make a change. As of today, your employment is whatever, terminated." And, he laid me off. And it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me because, I needed the time. I needed the time to support and grow blogTO. But I also needed the money. And that little bit of severance, I think it was only like 4 weeks, but even just like 4 weeks of severance was just, to me, the world. Because at that point, everything I was earning from my day job, I was just putting back into the business. And this was just like free time, free money. to do, what I really loved and really wanted to do. So in terms of your bookend, yes, you are correct. My blogTO career, not right at the beginning, but more or less started with me getting fired, and then it ended in the same manner.
That is the most epic bookend story ever, which we're going to dive more deeper into. So now I know because I was trying to do some research on you, and I found that you, in your early days, you were also kind of in New York. You also worked with some other media companies before getting into sort of the advertising space. So what was sort of the impetus that trigger that got you to even start the idea for blogTO while like as a side hustle almost back in 2004? What were you seeing at that point that was like, you know what, I should do this? Like, what was the frustration or pain point?
Well, there were multiple things. I mean, how long do I have here? How long an answer do you want? So, I mean, first of all, there was my interest in media, right? Like, I didn't come at this with no, kind of interest and desire to sort of be in the media space. And so I had, previous exposure through an internship after university working in media industry. And then I sort of, went a different direction. So this was really sort of coming back to media many years later, but coming back to it with some expertise. I think, a lot of people out there want, not everyone, but a lot of people want to be entrepreneurs. And there's something to be said for gaining some life and work experience and industry experience as well before you launch your own business. So I think those years that I had spent working, in the digital advertising world allowed me to understand the business side of what I needed to know to run and grow blogTO, because a lot of people historically, and also during the time where I was growing blogTO, because there were numerous competitors surfacing every few months, a lot of those media companies were started by people who came more from a journalism background. So they understood the content, they understood, the editorial, they had a vision for what they wanted to do from a content perspective, but I'm not sure that they understood how to make it a business, how to monetize it, how the industry worked, how to talk to advertisers. And so that's sort of where I came from it. I did not come from it from the content side, I came from it from the business side. I understood how this could become a business if we grew the audience to a certain level and we could monetize that audience. But again, to answer your question, so at the time in 2000, this was end of 2004. So just putting it in context for everybody, the internet really started becoming a thing, in the 90s, right? Late 90s, especially the dot-com boom. But it hadn't really transformed the media industry yet. There were these like portals, as I mentioned, like Yahoo, MSN. I mean, these were kind of the new kind of digital, platforms at the time that people went to get information. And there were some local sites. I mean, in Toronto, there was toronto.com. I think most people, there was, people in the industry anyway kind of referred to it as toronto.wrong. It had such a poor reputation. It was bad information, factually incorrect. It was just like not representative of the city. I think a lot of people were like, this is terrible. But it had the killer, at that point, like domain names were everything, and it had like the killer URL, of course, toronto.com, because at that point people just like, that's how they found websites. So, there was an opportunity there to sort of create something better. But the key innovation that took place, sort of, I would say, in the early 2000s was the advent of the blogging platform. And again, this might seem weird for people today to kind of appreciate, but at the time it was actually not that easy to create a website, at least one where you could publish articles like easily. That was the WordPress. Obviously, that was one of the early blogging platforms that has stuck around. Another one that blogTO used and a lot of other sites used at the time was called Movable Type. And again, it was just a very cheap and easy platform to, content management system, if you will, that allowed anyone really to just start their own publication. And that was the tremendous innovation at the time. Because again, to start a magazine, to start a newspaper, to start any sort of print or let's say radio or any other sort of legacy media, it was very expensive. So the barriers to entry to start a media company from like a business context, they kind of disappeared, right? So it was the innovation, but it was also assessing the opportunity and the market need. And from my perspective, Toronto deserved and needed something like blogTO to better reflect the city that we could all engage with. There were lots of, again, print publications at the time. Alt weeklies were kind of the big thing. If you lived in Toronto in the 90s or in the early 2000s before people really started consuming media online, every Thursday you would go to your street corner and there'd either be a Now magazine box or an iWeekly box, and you would open it and you pick it up, and that's how you engaged and learned about the new restaurants, the events, everything going on in the city from a culture perspective. So this was sort of a more modern version of that I think, and from my perspective, needed to exist.
Right. I think that's the time where I think I was playing around with like Blogger and WordPress and learning how to do like a self-hosted blog with WordPress.
Yeah, Blogger was like an even earlier version, but again, it wasn't as flexible as something like a WordPress, where you could have your custom domain and do a bunch of like more custom, design and development. Yeah,
I remember I'd set up Blogger and I set up the RSS feed burner. Oh, I was so thrilled. I was like, oh my God, this feed goes out to everyone.
Yeah, our RSS was huge back then. And all the blogs had a blog role, which is, again, that was also a very key component at the time because it was all about community. Community was a huge, I mean, it still is, but in the early days of blogTO, community was everything. And there was a huge, built-in community around, I guess, what you could call the blogosphere at the time. And Toronto I would say Toronto was at the forefront. If you looked at major cities around the world, Toronto had a very thriving kind of quote-unquote blog scene, and not just blogs like blogTO that were trying to cover the city. There was obviously there were personal blogs everywhere. I mean, that's how blogging started, right? I mean, the sort of old joke was everyone was just like blogging about their cat or like whatever, something very personal. And then out of that became more sort of like professional blogs that actually journalists and other people sort of created content around topics that had more wide appeal to a broader audience. And in our case, an audience that wanted to sort of learn about their city, to engage with the city. And anyway, on the side of all these blogs, you would have a blog role. And in the blog role, you would acknowledge all the other websites, all the other blogs that you thought were cool. And it was a way for self-discovery. People would come and you would learn about all these blogs because everyone had them, right? And you'd get requests from people, can you please add me to your blog role? So community was like a huge part of it. And anyway, in Toronto specifically, the other thing that was really big was photo blogs. Again, people I haven't heard the term photo blog in like at least a decade, but in 2004, photo blogs were huge. And Toronto was arguably the epicenter of like the photo blog universe. So we connected to that as well. And we ended up working with some of the quote unquote photo bloggers at the time. We helped, again, we interviewed them. We helped sort of amplify what they were doing. In fact, from a blogTO perspective, we did, some IRL stuff, in those early years at local galleries. And one of them was a big exhibition of local, photographs created by the photoblog community. And we supported that. We kind of put it on. So we're very much, there's very much a community around this whole like blogging world.
So I'm just trying to picture, your early days, you're working at Ogilvy and you have sort of your own cabin. Tell us a little bit more about like what those, like how did you build that early traction? How do you start sharing the content that you were making? Were you like feeling like you're going to get caught? Like what was those early days of blogTO, like getting that early traction, getting readers? How did you even get eyeballs or like, let's say distribution on the content that you were doing?
So the first one is one thing that I already mentioned, which was there was like this built-in community through the blog role and other things that there were many people at the time that were just sort of seeking out this sort of content, particularly at the time like younger, online users who, who were, maybe had a blog of their own, or certainly knew about blogs, and they were just seeking out, that's how they wanted to consume information. So again, at the time, most people were consuming information still, offline, right? You're still getting most of your information from newspapers or print sources or TV or whatever. But again, there was a small but growing percentage of the population that was using the internet and turning, it seems ridiculous now, like that a wide variety, most of the population didn't really use the internet at the time. But anyway, so people were, there were a growing group of people who were turning online and looking for the kind of information that we were creating. And because it was differentiated from what already existed, it was refreshingly new and exciting. And very sort of, one of the things as well with blogTO that I've always, really tried to, keep as like a core value is we were always very transparent and truthful. And so the content read that way, right? So people trusted it. So that was one thing, just that whole kind of, just natural online audience. The second thing I would say is that we actually started doing like what I would call like free or cheap like offline promotion driving to the website to sort of build awareness. And at that point, blogTO was just a website. We might have had like a Twitter feed or something, or like early days of Facebook, but we certainly didn't have like an Instagram account because Instagram didn't exist yet. We didn't have TikTok account, didn't exist yet. We weren't creating video content, at any volume, like we were sort of like later in the blogTO life cycle. Anyway, so a few of the things I'll just mention. So at the time, the National Post, one of the major newspapers in Canada, had a Toronto section that they published on Saturdays. And I got in touch, I can't remember how we connected, but either way, formed this relationship with the editor there at the time. And we ran essentially a blogTO feature in the newspaper every Saturday. And it said in big letters, from blogTO, and it had one of our articles. It was usually a restaurant review or one of our best of lists. And those are the things that we sort of became initially like most well known for. And this was just like free marketing, basically. You couldn't buy this thing. Like we would have, to buy a similar size ad in a national, well, I guess the Toronto section wasn't distributed nationally, but in a newspaper every week would have cost, we obviously didn't have the money for that kind of thing. So that was a very, I would say, effective way just to kind of build awareness. We also started creating what I refer to as these neighborhood maps. Okay, it was a completely separate product. It was branded blogTO. And basically they're these printed maps. And I actually got inspiration from traveling because I was in, I guess, at some point I was in some other cities like Mexico City and also in Buenos Aires. And I noticed I had these maps of neighborhoods. And as a tourist, and again, this was like very, very early internet days where you just didn't have access to this information online. So it was very useful to have this printed guide that showed you all the cool shops and restaurants in the neighborhood. So I just said, well, I'm going to create one of these for Toronto because no one else had done it. So we did this. And so we had, we expanded over the time. I think at one point we had 7 different neighborhoods that we had these maps for. And we distributed them for free. So thousands of maps we put out, every year. And again, it was just a way for people to like learn about blogTO. Wasn't necessarily like driving to the website, but it had the blogTO brand on there. It had the URL on there. So again, and those were actually, we accepted advertising in those. So that was essentially a marketing vehicle that didn't cost us anything because it was either break even or slightly profitable. So that was another key thing as well.
First of all, these are really great examples because what you're saying is if you kind of like sort of bring those ideas into today's context, you're kind of like put yourself where the audience is. And so like a social media version of that would be go respond under like people who already have a big audience, go respond into their comments and write something thoughtful and people will start noticing you. Like that's how people typically grow on social media. That's like a good example, but you did that in print and got in and got space there where people were already reading a trusted source, right? The other one was like doing some like guerrilla marketing, like locally creating this and creating awareness around your name. So these are like really smart ways to get that initial momentum for a startup. I would say, right? Fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that anything we were doing was necessarily revolutionary. I mean, I just sort of paid attention to, I mean, even again, so what we were trying to really replace at the time, at least in the initial days of blogTO, I mean, yes, from a digital perspective, we were trying to replace like Toronto.com, but really where most of the audience was, who was consuming the kind of content that we were creating, was reading the alt weeklies. So we were trying to replace, from a Toronto context, Now Magazine and iWeekly, which later became The Grid for a little bit. And I always noticed sort of clever things that they did. So, for example, Now Magazine was very well known for its Best of Toronto lists. So we created, again, early days Best of Toronto lists of our own. And initially we just called them like Best of Independent Toronto, because we really wanted to emphasize that it's all about like the local independent businesses. And then I recognized, a year or two in, that was like a little bit wordy, and we just kind of called it Best of Toronto. But anyway, so what Now Magazine did is they would not only sort of publish all these lists, but then they would send a letter and a window decal to all the winners. And so you'd go around the city, and in the window of all these restaurants and stuff, you would see a little decal that said, Now Magazine, Best of Toronto winner. And that is like, again, you can't buy that kind of marketing, right? That is just like free space for your brand. So it's like, we should do that too. So that's what we did. We created these Best of Toronto decals, and you can see them around the city today. And it says blogTO, Best of Toronto. And, even to this day, businesses receive them if they, get number one in a Best of Toronto list. And it's just easy, free marketing, brand awareness, and that's really key, right? I mean, it's not necessarily about like driving traffic to the website or driving traffic to like a social media account. Part of the challenge is really just like getting people seeing your brand everywhere and trying to figure out a way to do that in a very sort of natural and contextual appropriate way, but also a very cost-effective way.
In fact, that's how I discovered blogTO. When I moved to Canada in 2015, I was trying to find like, what are all the cool coffee shops? Where are all the good restaurants? And I would see like this blogTO sticker in like their windows or sometimes on the cash register. And I'd be like, what the hell is this blogTO thing? And that's how I kind of discovered blogTO. So it kind of worked. And I know that we're sort of talking a little bit about sort of what you did in your early days to get visibility, to get in front of people. Also, I think, some brand strategists might be oh, well, you were kind of associating with the right kind of businesses and building trust, blah, blah, blah. But one question that I would want to sort of take us maybe 2 steps back and think about, well, what is it during that time when you had just sort of started blogTO, and this is, I'm actually putting on a slightly different hat now, is for other people who are stuck in like jobs they hate, and they have like the side hustle idea that they've been sort of nurturing and noodling on, and they're just like scared to like take that leap. What was that initial days for you, that belief system or something? What was that early signs or small victories that you were looking for that gave you the confidence to go all in on blogTO?
So, good question. I mean, again, I think it's a number of things. So first of all, you're looking for traction in a number of ways, and there's the different data points that you can kind of look to. Some of it is just, you hear people talking about the brand who you don't know. You're just sort of out in the street and someone's mentioning blogTO. Or if you walk into a business, for example, when we're doing the maps, I actually was the person walking to business trying to get them to advertise in the maps. I wasn't trying to get them to advertise on the website. I actually never did proactive sales for the website, but I was doing proactive sales for the maps. And part of it is like when I walked into a business and talking to them about these like neighborhood maps, neighborhood guides, like had they already heard about blogTO? And that grew over time. And so again, it's just like that's one data point. But again, just like people out there you run into and talk about, meet whatever at parties and stuff, and people are like, yeah, I read blogTO all the time. I love, and more than that, like really positive affirmation where people are like saying, I love blogTO. Like it's my favorite website. Like that's amazing. Like they don't just know about it, but they love it. And not only do they love it, it's like they're number one. And it's the first thing that they read at the beginning of the day. It's the last thing they read, before they go to bed. I mean, that's amazing. That's amazing validation. So we're getting a lot of that. That probably would have been enough for most people. But with the digital media business, you also have the benefit of analytics, right? And you can see the analytics in real time. And these days there's like analytics for everything, but back then there was, just Google Analytics essentially was the main thing that I would say those who kind of ran websites used and still use today. And we could just see the traffic and the audience, increasing month after month. And even though we were really not a traditional company or organization by like any stretch of the imagination, we would have like these meetings. We would get together. I remember I did this whatever, I don't know, I can't remember if it was really a deal, but I had this arrangement with like InterAccess. InterAccess is it's a gallery that existed, at the time. It's not there anymore, but it used to be at the foot of Ossington, just north of Queen. And they had this basement space that they weren't using. It was a workshop space that was available certain evenings. And so I ended up saying like, can I, again, not wanting to spend any money, like trying to just do everything as like freely or cheaply as possible, was able to use this space for free, every once in a while. So that's where we had our team meetings, because we didn't have any office, but we needed somewhere to meet that was ideally not just like a coffee shop. So we used to meet there. I used to go down to the old Amsterdam brewery at the time, which used to exist, not where it is today. And it was, at the time, one of the early, I guess, quote unquote, craft beer companies before the craft beer explosion. And that also meant at the time, actually kind of surprisingly, that it was actually cheap beer. So you used to be able to go down and get like 25 beers or 24 beers for like $25, I think it was. And so I'd get that, I'd get some pizza, and we'd have these sort of team meetings. And one of the things I always did at these team meetings is I went through the analytics, which I think people appreciated. I don't think it was something that they were used to in whatever they did outside of blogTO. And I think it was really encouraging for people. They could see that people were reading their articles and that overall blogTO was growing at a pretty decent rate.
So now, okay, coming back to what we were just talking about, I might switch gears a little bit here and there, is now you were talking about, those early signs where you would sit down with your team, look at the analytics. Could you recall when you got that first money in the door for blogTO officially? And then at what point in the journey did you start making the amount of money where it started to match the salary that you left?
Yeah, so I do remember specifically the moment that I think you're referring to. So, again, like for the first year or so, like there was no revenue, right? I mean, quote unquote blogs were still like a new format. I think at the time, mainstream media, I know at the time mainstream media was trying to suggest that blogs were the opposite of what they were, which is they were saying they're not trustworthy and you should not advertise. Like it was sort of, there was this whole campaign, it seemed, from legacy Canadian media to discredit blogs. I'm sure they saw them as a threat. They saw potentially, that advertisers might go there because obviously that's where the audience was going. So there was this whole narrative about, that they're just not a safe advertising space. And, to be honest, some of them probably weren't. I mean, there were certainly some in the US in particular that were quite salacious and, I guess you could say not advertiser friendly, but not that blogTO was specifically advertiser friendly, but it wasn't a bad place for advertisers to be, certainly. I would obviously argue that it was a good place for advertisers to be. So anyway, little bits of money eventually started trickling in as blogTO got more, I guess, built more awareness, got more traffic. And, particularly, I think the early things that advertisers like approached us with, because I didn't go out there selling it. So I was never knocking. No, so I was never, it was all inbound. So I was focused on the product and I was focused on growing the audience. And I, trusted that the revenue would follow, but I didn't have a sales team. And I didn't go out there myself trying to generate revenue. So any revenue that was coming in was going to be inbound. So there were a few things at the time. So first of all, there was like Google AdSense, which was Google's offering to make it easy just, for advertisers to kind of to run ads on your site, basically. But essentially, not even banner, it could be text, banner, whatever, but like very, they were the middleman. Like the publisher didn't really get involved in terms of like finding that advertiser, but they just embedded the code on the website and got, a good chunk of the revenue. So that was sort of like low-hanging fruit. And then the earliest traction was probably from some of our best of lists. So we would publish lists like, the best wedding stores, or the best, it doesn't matter. Lots of best self-storage was a popular one. The best movers. So not ones that you probably think about, because I think a lot of people when they think about blogTO, they're like, oh, best pizza, best burgers, best Italian restaurants. But the ones that advertisers were actually most interested in was the non-food ones. It was like stuff that no one generally wrote about at the time. I mean, now there's like tons of SEO-driven content about them, I guess you could say. But at the time, like no one was putting out lists of like best movers, best self-storage, best wedding venues, and we also did these roundups on like Halloween parties and New Year's Eve parties. And so when people Googled them, and particularly those who worked in the industry Googled them, they would notice that blogTO's article often showed up number one. And so they would contact us. They'd be like, hey, how do we get on that list? Or how do we get on that page, depending on their question? And the answer to how you get on the list was always, you can't. Like, you can't buy your way into the list. And I think this was a big misperception about blogTO that I've tried to correct over the years, particularly on like forums like Reddit. I think there's a lot of misinformation about how blogTO makes money and whether blogTO's content was always authentic, or if it was advertorial or whatever. And what I can say is those lists and the content, it was always editorial, and we simply had a hard line, and this is just how I ran the business. We just did not allow advertisers to buy their ways onto the list. It was, again, it gets back to being trustworthy and being authentic and having authentic content, because readers can tell. Like, they kind of know what's good and what's not good. And if you put out a list that it's like, okay, yeah, clearly this isn't good, but they must have paid to get on the list kind of thing, then you're going to lose credibility, and then your audience is going to erode, right? So it's like, no, you can't buy your way to get on the list. So they're like, well, how do we get on the page? Well, it's like, well, we can sell you banner ads on the page. And so that's what we did. So that was how we made some of the initial revenue. We would sort of sell, whatever advertiser, they would own all the ads on the best self-storage page or the New Year's Eve party guide page or whatever it was, promoting their party or promoting their company. And that was like a little bit of revenue. Now to, again, get to the day, so where the big money is in media is it's not from local advertising. I mean, local advertising certainly adds up and can amount to, a significant amount of revenue. But it's stringing a lot of pieces together. What you really want is you want those media buying companies. So basically large, national, large brands, automotive, a lot of different industries that work with advertising agencies, that work with, these media buying companies. They spend serious money, right? So I remember working at Ogilvy. This is before I got fired. I was at Ogilvy at the time. And I remember distinctly, I went downstairs to like the lobby or whatever of the building to sort of take this call. And it was the agency that was representing Mini Cooper at the time, so the car company. And again, at context, like at the time, Mini was just getting into the Canadian, like Mini didn't exist. I guess it was like relaunching or whatever the case was, but it was like a kind of a new launch for the company in Canada. And I think to their credit, their agency was looking for innovative ways to advertise. So at the time, the blogTO website had this, I guess you could call it this photo space at the top of the website. It was baked into the design. So what we did is we actually had the logo, and then it had like your primary navigation. And again, this was like before before people were consuming content on mobile devices, so like desktop only, viewport essentially. And so at the top we had this rotating photo. And so, this representative was like, well, do you have any like interesting ideas of like how we could advertise? And I was like, yeah, how about we let you take over the photo space at the top of the website, and we do we get some like cool photos of Toronto, and in each of the photos there's a subtle like mini vehicle in there somewhere. So people are really looking at like a photo of the waterfront or a photo of like a certain neighborhood, but parked on the street is like one of your vehicles. So they thought that was a great idea. And so they approved, the ad, and they ran some banner ads and stuff as well, but that was kind of like the centerpiece of like what got them interested. And so that was the first, I would say larger ad campaign that we got. And that was, again, working in that industry. Again, you remember I was working at the time for these types of agencies. Like I was working alongside these media buying companies who are working for these advertisers. But again, I kind of kept it separate, right? I didn't talk to them about blogTO and like try to get them to whatever. So this was actually a buy from some other agency that I'd never worked for and didn't have any relationship with. So yeah, that was the moment that sort of I remember as sort of I felt, okay, I think this might work.
I actually also really like the fact, because you're from sort of the advertising space, you kind of know what they're trying to buy, versus what you're trying to sell. And you also understand the reader. Like you're not trying to be obnoxious with the reader. Like, you're like, just show them the pictures of Toronto. That's actually like the creative mind working both, making the advertiser super happy, but also making the experience of the reader. So now I actually wonder now, was that like a common thread or fabric for you?
The way I ran the business is I always put the reader first. Okay, every decision, I kind of went through. The key criteria is what's best for the reader. Okay, so that's why we didn't run advertorial. That's why we didn't sell these lists, right? Because I wasn't approaching it as like what's the best way to make money or what is the best thing for the advertiser. It was always what is best for the reader. And so part of that was actually keeping advertising to a minimum. Like in early days, we didn't actually have, I kind of talked about how there was no revenue for like the first year or so. And that's because we didn't actually have any advertising, or we maybe had like I can't remember, maybe like very, very, very tiny like ad space. But essentially, it was all about the content. It was always like, having a really great reader experience. And as this site evolved over the years, and as we expanded into other platforms like Instagram and TikTok, et cetera, it was always the same sort of approach, right? It's like, let's just create the best environment and experience for the reader or the follower or the viewer, whoever they might be. But to your point, it is a business. We do need to find a way to make money. So we need to do it in a way that both addresses the realities of the fact that we need to get some revenue here, and also create an offering that advertisers are interested in, but in a way that does respect our audience. And the best advertisers and the smartest advertisers, they get it. Like, you don't have to explain that to them. Like, they want to participate in that exchange. They don't want to do anything that is going to annoy the audience. And then other advertisers, sometimes you have to have a bit of a conversation about that as well, who maybe don't see it that way. But yeah, that's how I ran blogTO always to put the reader first.
Would you just say outright no to like, no, we're not doing that kind of banner ad? Like, no, that's against like blogTO.
Yeah, so at the time, again, this is like, going back a number of years, at the time, there were some very popular banner formats that a lot of sites, specifically these larger portals at the time that I referenced, like MSN and Yahoo ran. They had these, like, I can't remember all their names. They all had like different names. They like floated over the website and all this. They basically annoyed readers. But from an advertiser's perspective, because they were so intrusive, they were so effective. Like, you basically saw the ad, and in some cases you clicked on it because you couldn't avoid it. And so the metrics were really good. But from a reader perspective, I mean, this is what turned a lot of readers off these sites. Like people hated going to, at the end of the day, going to Yahoo and MSN and Toronto.com because they ran all these intrusive, annoying ads. And I'm sure even today, you can think about websites that are super annoying because they have too many ads on them, or they have the wrong types of ads, or they have the ads in the wrong places. So what I always try to do is keep ad space to a minimum, and again, to keep it, put it on a place where it was still going to be effective for the advertiser, but not in a way that intruded with the experience of visiting the site. Because again, like for a lot of people, this became like their favorite website and the website that they turn to every day. And that would not have been the case if, they had to kind of navigate through all these annoying ads. It would just been, too much friction there. So, so again, just kept that kind of ad space to kind of like a minimum, which also meant that the way I ran the business was I was focused on growing audience. I was not focused on maximizing revenue. And that might seem like a nothing statement, but that's not how most companies are run. Like most companies, they're trying to generate as much revenue as they can, and they don't want to say no to a lot of revenue opportunities. But that's what I did. I said no to a lot of revenue opportunities because to me, I was focused on growing the audience and maximizing the audience.
We didn't answer when's the first time you realized that you've now reached an income, out of the revenue coming in, that you can pay yourself the same amount that you left Ogilvy at? Like, how long did that take from the day that you got let go?
So, I don't know if I have as sort of concrete an answer for you on that one, but that ad buy that I talked about with Mini, that happened probably fairly closely to the time where just before I got fired. Like everything was sort of happening at once, where things were really kind of picking up and revenue was starting to increase to a level where I may not necessarily need a full-time job anymore to kind of make the money I needed to kind of funnel back into the business. So it just sort of continued from there in terms of like those sort of revenue opportunities and other advertisers. Because once, again, there's a sort of validation that happens. Because again, going back to what I had said earlier about there was this, again, this legacy media, at least narrative of like, to advertisers, like don't advertise on blogs, it's not a good space, blah, blah, blah. But then as other media companies and other large brands see that, other major brands are in those spaces, I can tell you that, other car companies would have seen, and other media buyers would have seen that Mini was now advertising on blogTO, and a pretty cool execution in that. That just sort of made it a lot easier for them to kind of sell it into their clients too, right? If you're Volkswagen, you're like, hey, listen, you guys also should be on blogTO. This is the audience you want. It's a safe space. Look, they've done it with Mini. You're not going to be necessarily the first. You're not the guinea pig. I don't think you're getting any backlash. So it just sort of continued from there. But, I guess the other answer to your question is I never paid myself a salary with blogTO. So I wasn't trying to match my salary with Ogilvy or improve on it. I just, again, I managed to sort of pay myself, money every year through, I guess you could say like a bonus based on how the business did. But there wasn't like a salary per se, at least in those first number of years that I gave myself, where it's like, yeah, I want to earn X amount of dollars and I'm going to pay myself that amount regardless of how the business does. And that's not how I did it. I just like whatever the bare minimum was that I could get by on personally to pay the rent and buy groceries and all that kind of stuff. That's what I would, essentially pay myself.
Yeah, like that's sort of one of the, you could call it like somebody who's sitting at a job making decent money and they're working on the side hustle. If going all in might mean there's a trade-off that you have to then make a decision that, hey, I'm gonna do what I love doing. I want to pursue this idea. You might not make the same amount of money, but you'll be really happy doing it. And I think there's another sort of thing there is like, if you actually love what you're doing, it doesn't first of all feel like work. And then even the failures, even when they do come, it's like you can still get up the next day and go, okay, let's start again. So did you have a similar experience, or like, I don't know, what was your experience like with those early days?
So the way I always ran the company in a very everything was very iterative, right? So tried to be very kind of strategic and thoughtful about new things that we would do, but it was always trying new things. I mean, the thing with the media industry, it's true today, but it was certainly also true throughout the 20 years that I ran blogTO, is that it's constantly evolving. I mean, if you think of just the number of significant changes over the last 20 years in terms of technology and media consumption, I'll just sort of list off a few, right? So, again, early days, it was just like the internet, okay? You needed like a website, desktop only. And then at a certain point, all of a sudden, the iPhone was invented. And then consumption was shifting, or at least equally existing on desktop and then mobile phones. And then there was the tablet, and you had to figure out where the tablet fit into the mix. And certain media companies made bets that it was going to be more prominent than others and invested more in it and whatever. But again, that was sort of something you had to keep in mind as well. And then there was social media. Again, these are like major milestones that people take for granted right now. But the fact that, again, consumption shifted to, first of all, a mobile device, but then people didn't necessarily go directly to that device or to go directly to a website URL to kind of read content. They would go to Facebook, or they'd go to Twitter or somewhere, and they would see links that their friends are sharing, or they'd follow a page and whatever, get the updates that way. So that was sort of a big thing that we had to obviously pay attention to and sort of figure out. And then those social platforms shifted to more like video platforms. And so then the business evolved, and where it exists still to today is less of a website business and less of a business that is about creating article-driven content, even though that remains a big part of it. And it's much more of a business around creating short-form vertical video content. And even like the term vertical, that changed over time. Originally, it was just video content, and it was square, and then it became vertical. So even the nature of video is evolved as those platforms have evolved. So I mean, I'm skipping over a whole bunch of them, but those are some of the sort of major updates that we had to pay attention to. And so I think strategically, I mean, there's a lot of other things that came and went that you could have made big bets on, and it could have been a disaster. And I think, I think more often than not, we made the right decisions and we placed the right bets on the right platforms or the right changes. We were early on TikTok, for example. We were on TikTok before really any other media in the country, I would say, which proved to be a good bet because TikTok today is arguably the most important platform to be on, maybe outside of Instagram, but probably in Canada, probably more important than Instagram. So things that didn't go as well, you had to recognize quickly, right? So again, this is sort of like a startup Silicon Valley kind of mindset, which is you got to fail fast. So that was always my mentality. If something is not working, it's like you can't just ride it out. That's like the wrong way to approach it. You have to fail fast, and you have to like pivot fast and move on fast. And there are certainly things that I did over 20 years that didn't work out, and I failed fast and I quickly ended, and maybe roughed up some feathers doing so because people didn't understand why so quickly these things were terminated or whatever. But that was kind of the mentality.
Speaking of like things not working, failing and learning from them fast, and sort of your analytical driven sort of approach to the business, like writing an article daily is testing something. Piece of content is like a little product that you're creating, right? And so the thread here is I was reading, like, just going down the Reddit rabbit hole, and again, I was just reading some of your interviews with some other organizations, and I read that, for you, writing headlines, which is also a point of like contention and controversy a little bit, which we can get into in a second, but testing out headlines, to see if people even read that content. Like one example that you wrote was like, if we write about Drake, it's going to get views, right? And then you had like a certain metric, like if it doesn't do at least 20,000 impressions, you're not even considering that, like that's like your benchmark, internal benchmark. So each article acts like a little product that you're shipping every day to see what's working and what's not working. But as part of that, there's sort of this spillover of like people feeling like those headlines might be clickbait. So now I'm kind of marrying this sort of startup iterative model with sort of the headline and how that comes out. And then sometimes readers can feel like they're clickbaity. I don't personally think they're clickbaity, not because you're sitting here, but because when I read the headline, it actually is contextual to what's inside. It's not misleading. It's not saying something in the headline that's got nothing to do with the article, which is what typically people do. So anyways, that's kind of the sentiment that I was looking at. So now, speaking of that iterative approach and those headlines, first part is, over the years, what did you realize worked? What didn't work in terms of people consuming content? And then how did you deal with some of that pushback and sort of that controversy that came with writing some of those headlines that actually got the views in the first place?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. I would say from a content perspective, I mean, content is not that different from a lot of other products in that packaging is critically important. If you go to the grocery store, there might be the best cookie that you would ever taste in your life for sale there. But if it's not in the right kind of packaging, it's not placed, it doesn't have the right distribution on the right shelf placement, whatever it might be, you're not going to find it. And that cookie's not going to be successful, and that's it. So this idea of like packaging exists across many aspects of our lives, but it also exists in journalism. It also exists in the content business. Regardless of what you feel about the quality of an article and how well it's reported, and if you like the style of the writer and if it's well written, the reality is you're not even going to be able to make that do that analysis and even read the article if there's not something about it that catches your attention. So with digital content anyway, and specifically with web content, I would say there's three key things. So one is absolutely the headline. You need something that sort of grabs your attention. Now it absolutely doesn't need to be a clickbait type headline, but it needs to be a compelling headline. And I think oftentimes those two things are conflated, where something that is written in a compelling way has at certain times been characterized as clickbait. For us, the photographs, the visual was also a key part of it, right? A very stunning visual really helps, draw a reader into the content. And for us, that is why we had a staff photographer. That's why we invested money in photography. And again, this might seem like a no-brainer, but a lot of publications don't. A lot of publications would prefer just to license photography from a place like Shutterstock, or they just might grab whatever they can for free off the internet or social media, and it's kind of like whatever generic kind of garbage photography. It doesn't do anything to elevate the article or the piece of content and the content's packaging. So that was also for us a very sort of key element. And then the third thing is you have to figure out where people are going to come across those two things, right? Where are they going to see the headline? Where are they going to see the photo? Because they're not necessarily coming to the website. They might be seeing it in a Google search. They might be seeing it on a social media platform, right? So then you have to think, well, how do I optimize it so that it's something that someone might want to click on, or that it even shows up in a Google search, or that it is, again, and this is part of, I think, maybe what has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way with the media industry. How do you optimize it for social feeds, right? Because then you're kind of, and this became a bit of a slippery slope for many of us in the industry, is you end up writing things for an algorithm because you understand the power of the algorithm, and an algorithm appreciates a certain type of image or certain types of headline, and then you kind of are, at the end of the day, writing for the algorithm. Doesn't exist as much today because, especially in Canada with the Online News Act, where you don't even really necessarily have as much distribution on social platforms. But there was a period in the media industry where optimizing your content for the Facebook algorithm was everything in terms of getting traffic and getting that sort of distribution and making it shareable and everything that you needed to, get people to view and sort of click on your content. And I think certain publishers, definitely took it too far, which is why platforms like Facebook started instituting anti-clickbait policies. Like they actually had guidelines saying, don't do this sort of stuff because we're going to deprioritize this in the algorithm. So it definitely became disadvantageous for publishers to write, quote unquote clickbait headlines. But I think at the end of the day, there was just a little bit of confusion, like what clickbait is. And I certainly had this discussion with people over the years. There's a difference between like a true clickbait headline, which is something that is completely misleading. Like you write a headline and someone clicks on it and the article is about something completely different. That's clickbait, right? You've baited someone into an article and the headline had nothing to do with it.
Bait and switch.
Writing a compelling headline is something altogether different. That is just, something that captures someone's attention. It's still fully related to the piece of content that people are going to read after they click on it. And I think people, more or less, there were some complaints about us writing headlines of a certain style that I would consider compelling headlines, or in some cases, headlines that they weren't clickbait, but they didn't give away the full story, right? Because the other thing that happens, particularly on social feeds, is people headline read, right? I'm sure you've done this, we've all done this, I do it. Not as much now, but certainly many years ago, I would just go through my Facebook feed and I would just like catch up on the news by reading headlines, because usually the headlines would give away kind of all you needed to know, right? I mean, yes, there was always more in-depth analysis or discussion of whatever the topic was, but even let's just say from a sports context, if all you needed to know or wanted to know that the Blue Jays won the game yesterday and the headline says, hey, Blue Jays beat the Baltimore Orioles, great. You don't need to click and read the article. You just got all the information you wanted. And that's not necessarily great for a publisher who's trying to, again, get an audience or get a user who is, essentially spends most of their time on a social media platform skimming headlines and getting them to actually click on it, because it's not really that meaningful for a publisher until they click on it and visit the website, at least for article-driven content. For stuff that is native to those platforms, which is a whole different discussion, it's a different story. But anyway, so I think this was like not a blogTO specific complaint or issue. This was a global, industry-wide thing that I think a lot of people were just like, a lot of readers and users were just a little bit frustrated with. And it is, again, I can appreciate too, because I talked earlier about being such a reader and audience-focused publication, like doing everything that's best for a reader. So I can understand that some people might see that there's a contradiction in trying to write a headline that gets people to actually read the article and always putting the reader first. But I think we tried to kind of, again, maybe not always successfully, but try to straddle that line.
You've built a media empire, which is getting like 300 million impressions. So if we had to take the Tim Shore's 3-step masterclass on writing headlines that get people to read your content, if you had to kind of break down what you're doing intuitively for the last 20 years into like a 3-step process, how could you do that for us? That would be great, actually. I mean, because everybody's today is trying to write content either on LinkedIn, try to grow their audience, or trying to drive traffic to their business, or trying to talk to their readers about a specific topic or share news. So what's the Tim Shore masterclass? The person who's been able to scale to 300 million. That's not the peak I'm saying. That's just the last number that I could find.
So again, I don't want to take credit for anything, because I don't think we didn't reinvent it. Like, we didn't create anything here that was, first of its kind. I mean, there's a whole industry and a lot of publications surfaced, probably well after blogTO. BuzzFeed would be like a good example. I mean, the owner of BuzzFeed, I mean, they kind of perfected this, right? I mean, they sort of understood deeply the power of social media algorithms and how to, I guess, game these social media algorithms. And part of that was, again, the packaging, photo, headline. So all of this stuff is kind of out there. Like, we didn't create the rules, we just kind of followed the rules, I guess you could say, or maybe took the rules and kind of made them our own. So like I would say most, if not all publications, we had editorial scope and style guidelines, and this is sort of the direction that we gave to all our staff in terms of like, this is how you do things. And within those guidelines, there was a page about this is how you write headlines. And these are, the best practices, 5 things to keep in mind, or whatever it was, in terms of what you need to keep in mind to write a headline. And those things weren't necessarily unique to us. Like other publications that, again, were, had the same philosophy or same approach to how they wanted to distribute and package their content, they were using very similar rules. And there's a lot of derivative work that also happens in the media industry. So when we would do something, we would see countless others kind of doing the same thing that we were doing, and whether they were copying us or whether they were copying maybe whoever we got inspiration from, who knows, but everything then starts to look, very similar, and you start to see like similar headlines, similar articles sort of like all over the place. But at the end of the day, you did ask for a few things. So first of all, and it's changed over times, by the way. And I think what a lot of publications still do, but certainly what a lot of publications did, I would say, a few years ago, is they would...
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, just to contextualize the question a little bit more. Because a lot of the stuff over 20 years has become common knowledge, instinct for you, and it's common knowledge. But somebody out there sitting, like trying to figure out, how do I write something that will get people to read it? They might be really sharp, but they just don't know how to articulate it. And you have a format. And you're like, everybody uses this format. This is common knowledge, Paul. What are you talking about? But for somebody taking that first step, how would you break it down for them?
You've always got to think about distribution is key, right? I mentioned this earlier. Where are people going to see this? Because what you actually can end up doing, and what I think a lot of publications do, and certainly did, is they write 2 headlines. And this can all be controlled in like the metadata on the page. So they write a headline that is optimized for social distribution, and they write a headline that is optimized for search, or these days maybe Google Discover, which is a more important distribution channel for most publications than traditional Google search. And those 2 headlines are different. And the reason that they're different is because these platforms and these algorithms, they kind of want different things, right? Something like Facebook wants something that is inherently shareable, right? So a headline you want to construct in a way where people engage with it. And ideally, the best way for people to engage with stuff is to share it, for us anyway. But if they're not sharing it, we at least want them to like it or comment. So there's got to be something in the packaging, something in the headline that prompts someone to engage it in some way, either like it, comment, or share it. The other headline, as I said, is headline that is being optimized for search or for Google distribution. And for that, you're just really trying to do it so that it shows up in Google results, whether it's results in traditional search, Google News, or Google Discover. And so you have to understand those algorithms in terms of what Google is looking for, and those can be a little bit more keyword driven. Based on, again, depending on which of those 3 Google distribution channels we're talking about, they're all a little bit different. So there's no one answer for both. Like, you have to treat each of them in most cases separately if you're really trying to approach it in a kind of really kind of specific way. But if you're, generally speaking, you do want your headline to be concise, okay? You want it to be descriptive, right? But at the same time, you want there to be some sort of hook of some sort, something that gives readers wanting to kind of engage or learn a little bit more. And this is where I sort of touched upon earlier, not giving everything away in the headline itself. So it is a science, and honestly, some people are really good at it, and some people are not as good at it. And certainly on our team on any given basis, there were always some people that were really good at writing headlines and other people that really struggled, despite both of those, everyone having the same guidelines, the same training. So it is a bit of a skill. And certainly some publications, employ people who are, specialized headline writers who have that kind of unique knack of writing compelling headlines.
And so with sort of your experience, you could probably easily spot a good headline writer versus kind of So what do you look for? Like, what is I know sort of you just kind of touched on, like, that you're looking for, like, it should be short, should not give away what the contents are. Like, like the Blue Jays just won. That's like a very factual information, actually. Whereas I think there's something that you wrote, which was like a portal from hell or something that was in that Reddit thread, which I thought was so funny, actually. I was like, I want to read what this is. Like, what is this thing?
Yeah, no, exactly. So you want to use, so just to kind of expand on what I said earlier. So first of all, you need to use words that people understand, right? If you throw a word in there that people don't know what it means, like a complex word, something that's in the dictionary, but like most people don't know the whole dictionary, that's a mistake, right? It has to be like, you can't have the reader have to like think about like, what does this headline mean? Like, what am I reading here? Like, it has to be an instantaneous, like, I understand what this is. Whether it's compelling or not, like, they have to at least like understand it. So you also don't want to be too wordy, right? Because a headline that is not concise, that is too wordy, also will just like take a little bit extra time to process and understand what it means. But then to your portal from hell, example, you're right. You got to make it interesting, right? I mean, can't be boring, right? I mean, there's a lot of news that is a little bit boring or factual. So trying to find a way to like spice it up a little bit, and particularly for blogTO, where we would like to inject some personality into our content. There are lots of media companies like Reuters and Associated Press out there who are not that interested in like editorializing their content. They just want to provide like just very vanilla, plain, fact-based, headline and articles. And then there's publications like blogTO where writers were encouraged to inject themselves, inject their voice, give a little bit of personality, into the articles, which, not everyone liked, but, there's certainly an audience for that kind of content.
That's actually super helpful. So if I quickly summarize, one is keep it short. Keep the reading level like grade 5. Like, the word should be something that everybody understands. This is kind of the philosophy my dad also uses, like, write for the common person. Don't write for professors. And don't reveal everything up front, but be true to what's inside the article. Like, again, we're not trying to be clickbaity. But it definitely like gets somebody to engage and think about, well, what is this all about? And then I think the one point that you made, which I thought was like super helpful, is also contextualizing where is this going to show up? And then writing the headline for those instances. Like, is somebody going to see this in like a social feed somewhere pop up? And like, because, like that first 2-3 lines show up and then the headline shows up. And then, versus they're not going to just see it in that beautiful blog, that article format that's on your site. They're going to see like a snippet of it, kind of like a YouTube thumbnail. Like, will they click on it to see more? So I thought that was actually very helpful as well, in addition to the other stuff that you just sort of outlined.
Yeah, it's the same for all content. I mean, you've got, you mentioned YouTube, but Instagram, TikTok, I mean, all of this content has its own sort of, they're all dealing with algorithms, and they all have their rules around packaging, whether it's thumbnails, captions, hashtags, whatever. So it's just the reality of the nature of the business that, to be successful, I mean, you do obviously have to have unique and compelling and good content, but then you also have to understand how it gets distributed and how you some of the best practices around packaging it.
I think somewhere in an interview you said, we're not trying to cover City Hall. That's not the only topic people care about, right? People care about what's happening in my neighborhood, and so what's the sort of background and story behind sort of what did you choose, like where did you draw the lines, and guardrails of like?
Yeah, so the scope definitely evolved over the years, and also, it was different by platform, right? What blogTO covered on the website was a little bit different than what blogTO was covering on Instagram or TikTok. Those were, traditionally like the three main platforms to this day that Online News Act, C18 aside, blogTO was sort of prominent on and had the most following. So, it was, first of all, blogTO was positioned more as a kind of lifestyle publication, not as like a hard news publication, but news was part of the scope. So it was unique in that way because a lot of, especially media companies, legacy media companies, they kind of like to separate those two pieces of content. They like to have, even if you think of the Toronto Star as an example, they have the newspaper, which is news and investigative reporting, hard news, got a wide range of different types of content on there. But for things like event listings and roundups and more kind of like, wider scope of like food and cultural stuff, they'll put that on a different site. They'll put it on toronto.com, or back in the day, that's what the Grid was there for as their alt weekly or iWeekly. It kind of separated those things together, or separated those things out. And I didn't want to do that. I kind of wanted to just like have a little bit of everything, but not feel like we needed to be, I guess the New York Times uses I think they still use the terminology, they're the newspaper of record. We didn't feel like we needed to be like the newspaper or the publication of record, right? We weren't trying to have everything, right? It was a curated experience of Toronto. So we decided every day what stories we thought were interesting or what stories we thought our audience might find interesting. And there's a lot of stuff we decided not to pursue. And sometimes we would get feedback on it that'd be like, hey, there was an election last night. How is it possible that blogTO didn't cover the election? And we're like, we probably did, but we probably didn't cover it extensively. And we were like, our perspective was like, what, CBC or some other publication did a really good job of election coverage. They've got extensive breakdowns of like every riding and every candidate and all that kind of stuff. We didn't feel like there was a need to kind of replicate that. We didn't feel like there was anything that we could add. The stuff that we thought we could add that was a little bit differentiated, that's what we did. We did produce that stuff, but we weren't gonna just like do everything. We didn't feel like there was a need to do that. And because we're always dealing with limited resources, we always have to make these choices. We just don't have, frankly, the resources to cover like every single thing. So we always, try to cover our own lane and cover content and cover the city in a way that others weren't covering it. And to me, that's also a key ingredient of a successful publication. You need to have something unique. If your readers feel they can get, whatever you're putting out, you can get it somewhere else, well then why do you exist at that point? It's a little bit different if you're first or later in the game. I mean, there's lots of competitors that came aboard later that tried to duplicate blogTO, but we never approached it as trying to like copy someone else. I mean, we were inspired by certain things that other publications might have done, but we always tried to be unique and differentiated. On any given day, we would just curate the news. We would curate our restaurant coverage. I mean, just because a restaurant exists, just because a restaurant opened, we didn't necessarily feel like we needed to mention it or cover it. If we thought it was unique in some way, we thought it was good, if we had a point of view on it, if we felt like there was something we wanted to do about it that we thought would be of interest to our audience, then we would cover it. And if none of those things existed, we wouldn't. And we got complaints too. People were like, why didn't you cover this place? Same thing with events. Not all events are interesting. Some are kind of boring. Or some we feel like weren't really a fit for our audience for whatever reason. So we just didn't bother covering them. So I think, good publications, they do have a point of view and they kind of like stick to it and they don't try to be everything for everybody. And that's what blogTO was. Wasn't trying to be everything for everybody.
The kind of content that you're doing is a little bit more advertiser friendly, because I think like one is like kind of negative news, like versus like happy, positive kind of stuff. Like here's all the cool stuff that's happening in the city, right? So that's one sort of line of thought. And then the other one, I thought like you had like an interesting perspective, and I would love to sort of go deeper into that, is how you looked at the competition. Like typically when people look at competition, you're like, there's like that sort of negative, but you're kind of like, well, what could we learn from this? And can we also avoid doing versus instead of trying to copy them? That's I thought was kind of unique. Like, because typically people are like, well, they're doing that, we should copy them to FOMO. But you were like, no, we don't have to do that kind of content. Like, not everybody wants that kind of content. You know, like you said, there's a lot of sites that came up. Some actually went away. Some are still around. And it's not all like rosy out there. It is competitive. It is a little bit cutthroat. So how did you, of course, from the early days, in the last 20 years, how did you deal with competition? How do you think about competition?
Well, I think you need to pay attention. You need to be aware of the competitive landscape. And the competitive landscape in media you can define it in different ways. So for me, I always defined it in as broad as possible terms, as I could. So for example, when Uber Eats was launched, I saw Uber Eats as competition, which you might think is crazy. But in addition to it being an app where you can order food for, pickup or delivery, it's also a restaurant discovery app. If you think about it, it's like you might just, rather than go to blogTO and which we also thought we wanted to be restaurant discovery, but rather than go to blogTO and be like, okay, what are the restaurants that are interesting and where do I want to eat tonight or what do I want to get takeout? I'm sure a good chunk of people would just go directly to Uber Eats and they'd be just like, well, okay, what's an Uber Eats that looks interesting? And they would just kind of bypass, all the food media, just go directly to that platform. So that was competition. Yelp. Again, another from a food perspective, again, bit of a different thing. In Foursquare, when it was around, these were different ways to engage with local restaurants, local businesses. Very different format than blogTO, but still, another place that people could turn to for, essentially addressing whatever their need around, restaurant discovery. Google. Competition. You don't want to compete with Google if you can avoid it, but when Google started, putting, their own little, again, I'll use a restaurant example, but, when they started putting their little restaurant information right in Google searches, in terms of like the address and, reviews and all that kind of stuff, again, that was in a certain way, like a little bit competitive to, a blogTO, restaurant review or content. And these days, like AIO reviews, you could look at, again, Google and anyone else that is doing them, or something similar, summarizing the news, summarizing information. That's going to be competitive. Facebook at one point decided that they were going to get into events. They've since kind of moved away from it, but there was a point where they had their own dedicated like events app. And blogTO, we wanted to be the place for people to come and sort of find out about the events happening in the city. So all of a sudden, Facebook was competition. Then you've got, from a web perspective, you've got a huge range of competition. You've got, all the Toronto-focused publications, both legacy media as well as like the new digital native upstarts. And because blogTO was trying to do a few different things, again, I mentioned restaurants and events, but of course we were news, we were stores, we were, a whole bunch of things. That just widened the scope of competition, where we were essentially, from my perspective, competing, depending on the kind of content that we're talking about and the kind of need that we were addressing in terms of local information and content, like we had a whole different competitive set depending on sort of what that was. And then when you take it to other platforms such as TikTok or Instagram, all of a sudden you're competing with influencers or other totally different media brands that only exist, like a SixBuzz or a Wave Room that only exist maybe on one or two platforms and aren't web, in most cases web focused at all. So, the competitors came and went certainly over time, and some, some got better over time, some stayed the same, some got worse. But yeah, that was sort of my job, I felt, as running the show at blogTO, to really kind of pay attention to that. I mean, that's what you kind of worry about. It's like, what is that thing, whether it's a competitor or a new distribution platform for content or a new way that people are consuming content. Like, those are the things that are going to really disrupt potentially a business and certainly disrupt, potentially blogTO, that I would just want to make sure that I was up to speed and aware of like everything that was going on. But yeah, to your point about, so what do you do about that? Again, you're still trying to have your lane and your focus. I mean, you have your own strategy. You're not trying to necessarily be a CBC, or you're not trying to necessarily be whatever, a wave room. But you still need to understand like where your audiences sort of intersect, and where they might have the choice of going for similar content from like both of you, and make sure that yours is maybe offering something ideally better or differentiated from that other option.
Yesterday, when we were sitting in the park, touched on a really interesting idea, which was how people search for information. There's no longer a single source of truth. I think that's like one that's I've been thinking about that. Like, we kind of know it, but kind of you articulated it really well. So that's like one of the, I would say, in my mind, what's one lesson about the reader that you've learned over the 20 years, which ties into sort of this competition? Like, somebody's looking for information, they don't just look in one place. So how do you see that, and what's your experience been like? And then how does blogTO, according to you, fit into that sort of?
Well, first of all, I think you need to respect the reader. You need to respect that they're going to go to multiple places, and that's totally okay. Like, we never had the expectation that people were just going to come to blogTO for everything that they wanted to like learn or engage with around Toronto. You need to be okay with that. And if you are doing things that the reader identifies as maybe like disrespectful in a way, where you are trying to hide the fact that these other brands, these other options exist, I think they'll notice, and your brand will be lesser for it. And unfortunately, I think that's the way a lot of media companies are run. I'll sort of go back to what I talked about ages ago at this point, at the beginning of our conversation, about the state of media when I started blogTO, which was these alt weeklies. And again, at the time, there was iWeekly, there was Now Magazine, and it was widely known, at least those in the industry and keen observers, that they always pretended that each other didn't exist. Now Magazine writers and whatever were forbidden to mention iWeekly or on the website link to anything like that. It's like, pretend it doesn't exist. And iWeekly, the same thing. Like, pretend that Now Magazine doesn't exist. And it's just, very disrespectful to readers, because first of all, as a consumer, what I would do, I would pick up both. When they came out every week, I would go pick up both. There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. I might prefer one over the other, but you should respect me as a consumer, that I do want probably this information or news from multiple sources. Even if I have a preferred source, like I still probably want it from a few other places as well. And I think that's okay. So, again, this gets back to early days of blogTO and the whole blog scene and community, which was very, very much in favor of that, sharing the love, right? Through the blog role. We weren't trying to gatekeep, content and sort of pretend that all these other cool blogs didn't exist. We were like, no, you can go check them out. They're some of them might be doing similar stuff that we do, but like, that's okay. Check them out. You decide for yourself what you want to come to blogTO for and what you want to maybe check them out for. And you just need to respect the reader at the end of the day.
Like, what's that secret sauce that those companies missed or misunderstood about the market or the reader, that they became irrelevant?
Yeah. As I said, there's healthy competition in the space, particularly in Toronto. I think most people would characterize Toronto as a very kind of content and media saturated city, and other cities are as well. And again, different competitors on different platforms. But yeah, I mean, there were, starting first, sort of, I guess, in the web era, before, getting into like the whole social media landscape. There are a lot of websites that started after blogTO that tried to do something similar. There was one called the Toronto Standard that actually produced amazing content. Like it was very good. They had a bigger budget. It was owned by someone connected to the real estate industry. I guess they decided that they wanted to run and own a media company. And so they set up offices at the Burroughs building on Queen West. They had a big launch party. They hired probably what I'd characterize as like the cream of the crop of, some Toronto journalists and freelancers. And they produced, some amazing content. But they ultimately failed. And I think they failed for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, they expected too much success. I mean, I'm sort of, again, hypothesizing here because I don't obviously have insider information on the business, but I got the sense that they expected success to come earlier, right? I think with blogTO, we had a very long time frame. And part of the reason that I started it when I had a full-time job is I didn't expect it to be my full-time job in year one or even year two. Like this was going to be something that was going to be, we were growing, but it was going to be, over time. And it was going to take a number of years for this to, it was a number of years before we could afford to hire like our first full-time employee. And this is a company, the Toronto Standard, that had on day one, lots of full-time employees, right? And they didn't have an audience yet. They didn't have any revenue yet. And so I've saw a lot of media companies like that where they had the funding, and some of these were like a nonprofit model, where they had the money, but they had, what I can only imagine was, expectations that they would get to a certain place within 1 to 2 years of running the business, which they never did. They never became profitable that quickly. They never grew that quickly, even though some of them were producing, had a really great product.
And so the other thing that sort of comes to mind is, and I know that, because you are sort of you lean more on like, well, how does this make money? What's the business size, the analytics? And I think it's a great segue, sort of which you started is like, so when I think about like the finances of things and especially early days, I think you already touched on like two big topics. One is you didn't raise any money. You couldn't pay people that much because you didn't have the VC money to like subsidize like all that stuff, right? So now, having said that, where I would want to start is, could you think like looking back 20 years, maybe like 2 or 3 instances where you had to make really tough decisions, like I can't pay my rent next month, or, how am I going to pay for this? Or like anything that you can think of, like 2 or 3 examples of like, because of those decisions, what were some of the toughest moments for you?
Yeah, there were, I would say, a lot of, in hindsight, I mean, I'd characterize them now as bad business decisions that I made, but at the time they were necessary based on the situation. So the original vision, I mean, there was original vision for blogTO, but I saw pretty quickly that the needs that we were addressing in Toronto existed in like every other city. And certainly they existed in other cities in Canada. They existed in Vancouver, they existed in Montreal. There were no other or very few blogTO-like publications in those cities back in like 2004, 2005. And so I started them. So the original vision was actually this like network. blogTO was the first. And then the second one was in Vancouver. It was a site called Beyond Robson, which was, blogTO for Vancouver, essentially. The branding strategy was very intentional. I wanted to, because others took different approaches over the years, but this was really wanted to give every city their own identity and have people really connect with that brand in their city. I didn't want it to be like this global or national brand that just like whatever existed in that city. And something like Beyond Robson, if you know Vancouver, there's this major street called Robson, which is like Yonge Street. It's like mainstream whatever. Big box stores, well, not big box stores, but yeah, like big brands. And, it also, by calling it Beyond Robson, you place it in Vancouver with the Robson connection, but the Beyond suggests that we're kind of looking for more interesting things than what exists on just like the most mainstream, major streets in the city. So I think that connected with a lot of people. And then roughly around the same time, I started a site in Montreal called Midnight Poutine. Okay, and obviously that connects with people in Quebec and Montreal because of the whole poutine angle, and it was just like a fun name that people kind of related to and responded to. A little bit long maybe, as was Beyond Robson, bit of a long name, but it seemed to work. Anyway, so those sites were gaining a following, and again, just to put in context, there weren't really other, sites like those that existed in those markets. There are today, but in 2005, there wasn't. And there was, just like in Toronto, there was an opportunity. It's an opportunity all around the world for a site like blogTO, or multiple sites like blogTO potentially in each of these like major cities. So those were growing, but blogTO was growing faster. And it was a little bit easier, a little bit's probably an understatement, it was a lot easier for me to kind of run blogTO from a day-to-day perspective because I understood the city more and I was present in the city. And I did go out to, and I actually spent 4 years living in Montreal because I went to McGill University, and I went out and met with the team a couple times in Vancouver while I was running Beyond Robson. So I did try to connect with both of those teams and had various levels of understanding of what was going on in those markets. But it was challenging. And the other context here is that, as you know, as we just talked about, this was bootstrapped. So it didn't have like loads and loads of money floating around. So each of these sites had the same challenges that blogTO had, which is, they're growing audiences and there's a huge business opportunity here, but there's not a lot of resources to pump into them. And by the way, I have to kind of make a choice. Is it better to put those resources in blogTO, which is growing a little bit ahead and growing faster, and Toronto's like the main market in Canada? Or do I sort of siphon off and like cut blogTO a little bit short and give it less resources than it needs and put those into Vancouver and Montreal? So, if I had to do it over again, I would have loved to find a way to keep those going because the business strategy proved to be correct. I ended up deciding to like discontinue both of those sites and just like divert all of my attention and all of my resources into blogTO. And I think that obviously helped blogTO. But there was still a business case 100% for continuing those sites. And, in their absence, other ones came up. So we kind of opened the door in Vancouver for a host of other sites, primarily, I would say, what later became Daily Hive, which was also acquired by Zoomer Media, the same company that acquired blogTO. And then in Montreal, Montreal's a little bit different because there's English and French language, but Midnight Poutine was predominantly an English language publication. And the site that came up there that actually a lot of people thought was associated with blogTO was called Montreal Blog, which then became Narcity. Well, it didn't become Narcity, but it then became like Narcity grew out of that, and then Narcity became this big national Canadian digital media brand. So, whether they would acknowledge it or not, I do think closing both of those sites kind of opened the door a little bit, or at least presented less competition for the founders of those publications to kind of get those started and find success.
I would love for you to at least share one thing that you would have done differently that you haven't shared already.
Well, as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of different business decisions that I, in hindsight, would have made differently, and specifically like strategic ones, like as I said, what happened with the sites in Beyond Robs in Vancouver and Montreal. But I'll answer the question a little differently. I'm not gonna sort of touch on those kind of strategic decisions. I think the thing that was always a challenge for me is I'll get back to the staff and just sort of like, because we had so many amazing staff over the years. I think they're amazing. And a lot of them were freelance. Some of them were full-time employees once we actually had enough money to hire full-time. And there are definitely periods throughout the years where we just had, and it was like one great group after the other. So it wasn't just like this one moment in time where we had a great group and that was like the glory days. It was like we had a great group, and then we had another great group, and then we had another great group. But what that sort of speaks to is that it was very difficult for me to find a way to really kind of retain core staff all the way through, right? blogTO ended up getting a reputation in the industry as a really good place for someone to start their career. So we ended up, hiring and finding amazing talent. where this was their first job, or maybe in some cases their second job. In many cases, it might have started with an internship, or the first job after they did an internship somewhere else. And a lot of those people have gone on and had amazing careers within the industry. Some of them have left the industry and had great careers outside of the industry. So I'm really proud of the people that have been part of blogTO, and I think that I think the industry would acknowledge that there's some amazing talent that have sort of flowed through blogTO. And they still have, bright futures ahead of them as well. Their careers are certainly not over. But it was a challenge for me, I think, to, just to kind of retain them. I mean, part of it is we were just so small. We didn't have like the career growth opportunities, a very flat organization. I think there were things that we could have done to maybe create more opportunities for staff to grow. Oftentimes we could grow to a certain extent from a compensation perspective, but their role basically stayed the same. They started a junior reporter, intermediate, then senior, more or less doing the same job throughout that trajectory, but getting compensation increase. That's not really the career growth that like most people are looking for, or they're looking for that for a certain amount of years, and then at the end of the day, they're looking for something a little bit more challenging, or really trying to develop their skills in other areas, take on more, senior leadership responsibilities. And it was a challenge, I would say, just based on the organizational structure and how I ran the business to really provide those opportunities for people. The other thing that's sort of related to that is like the culture. I mean, we've talked about analytics, we've talked about, a lot of different things. These days, what should be and is rightly so like very important is what's it like to work for a company? Is this a great place to work? And what is there's different things that play into that, like work-life balance is a big thing for a lot of people, rightly so, but there's a lot of other things, right? I mean, how is a manager, what is their managerial style? And I think there are certainly lots of room for improvement over the years in terms of my managerial style. I would definitely get in the weeds of the business where perhaps I shouldn't have in certain cases. And for some people that may have been overstepping, or they may not have understood it. But part of it also, I think, getting back to like work-life balance, is that I always viewed blogTO as a startup. Like even 15 years in, I still considered it a startup, and I still considered that it could all go away, next month kind of thing. Like despite everything, all the successes, everything that we achieved, the brand name recognition, the audience growth, the revenue, it could all disappear, if one or two bad decisions or whatever. If we took our foot off the gas, it could just disappear. So
just ask Toronto Star.
Yeah, well, I mean, so for me, that's very much like a startup mentality. And when you're in a startup, you're fighting for your existence. And when you're fighting for your existence, you're just like doing anything you possibly can to exist and be competitive and being at, number one or whatever your sort of objective is. And so for myself, I didn't have a lot of work-life balance. I mean, I had a family, I had 2 kids, and I certainly, did all I could, or tried to do all I could to be present in their lives and be like, have that life outside of work. But if I'm being honest, at the same time, like even after the acquisition, because I was still, even though I wasn't as financially invested in the business at that point, I was still emotionally and in other ways invested in the business. I just wanted it to continue to be successful, and I didn't want it to get worse or deteriorate in any way. So, work weekends, work evenings, work when I'm on vacation. This is not what people consider like a work-life balance, right? But that was for me. Like I would like to think that I didn't expect that of all my staff. But, I think people kind of see, you see what your leaders are doing, and are they setting the right example or whatnot? And I think some people would see that as like, oh, this is amazing. Like he's doing all this stuff, like he's going above and beyond and seeing it as help and an additive to like the overall operations and organization. But I could also see it as like, see some people maybe looking at it a different way, saying like, this is a little bit unhealthy. You know, this guy works too much. And is he expecting me to work, you know? And then I think we had a lot of flexibility, and at the end of the day, we had very loose rules around, you know, hours and people needed to work and stuff. Like I wasn't, whether people got this or not, like I did not expect people to work more than a standard work week. But the hours were a little bit all over the place, right? I mean, but we would talk about this during the hiring process. So nothing really should have been hopefully a surprise to people, but it would be like, yeah, this isn't really a 9-to-5 job. You know, we cover events, we go to brunch, like we do all these things that don't exist like during a Monday to Friday 9-to-5 schedule. They exist on weekends, they exist in the evenings. Like this is when the city comes alive. So you should just expect, you know, to have like a changing and flexible schedule like that. But yeah, to get back to my point, like I don't think I ever successfully transitioned away from this like startup mindset. I think even until like maybe my last days there, yeah, I still just like always kind of considered, even 20 years in, like blogTO is still a startup, and we got to fight for everything, and it could all go away. All go away tomorrow.
At what point in this journey thought come to you that, oh, I'm ready, I want to sell this now?
Never. I had no interest in selling the business.
You had no interest
interest in selling the business. So 3 to 4 years ago, and again, this was sort of just as we were kind of coming out of the pandemic. You know, I guess some media companies were sort of flush with cash at the time, and decided that they were in the market for acquisitions. And I think most of the companies that were looking to get more into digital, and probably more into like social video, which is also a strong component of blogTO. And so, yeah, I started like out of the woodwork getting inquiries from, you know, a number of different companies. It wasn't the first time. I mean, years ago, you know, various had reached out, but this was like the first time where a number of companies at once, within like a short time frame, a couple months, had sort of connected with me, exploring whether I'd be open to a sale. And I wasn't, to be honest. Like I was very content. I was never looking for an exit. You know, I was just very content to just continue to grow this and run it. But I decided, I was like, you know what, I'll have these conversations. You know, I can always say no. I can shut it down. It's just a bit of a time investment here. So it was really just exploratory, even up until the moment, the day that I like made it official and like signed all the legal papers. Like I wasn't 100% sure whether I was going to do that. I was mulling it over up until the very last second, and again having conversations, you know, with my family and others about like pros and cons and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, it was not something that I was looking for.
What are some of the pros and cons?
I would say the major pro is just like financial security, right? So again, the way I was running the business, I wasn't necessarily paying myself bags of money. I was creating an asset, and I understood that. I understood that, you know, there was this blogTO asset that I had created, and was, you know, the asset value was potentially increasing over time. So I understood that it was going to be worth something, but I wasn't, you know, paying myself the big bucks. I wasn't like living a lavish lifestyle. And not that I'm doing that now either, but, you know, there is something to be said for having money in the bank and financial security for, you know, my family and all that kind of stuff. So part of it was like, you know, the proverbial like taking money off the table. It's just like, is this the right time to like take, you know, should I take this money's there, you know, it's available. So that was part of it. The other thing I struggled with is really not having a good sense of what blogTO was worth. I think at the end of the day, people will say it's worth what someone's going to pay for it, or it's worth what you're willing to sell it for. And I did struggle with, you know, because again, and especially in the Canadian marketplace, there weren't any, or certainly very many, similar transactions. Like we kind of set a precedence for other companies that followed. You know, Zoomer, for example, ended up acquiring a bunch of other digital properties. So I'm sure they kind of looked at, okay, this is, you know, what we paid for blogTO, or these other founders who were selling probably were like, okay, this is what they pay, this is what blogTO sold for, so this is what I think we're worth based on whatever modeling they were doing. But again, it wasn't like, you didn't know. And even to this day, like, I kind of think like it was probably worth more money than what I sold it for. But again, that's whatever. Like, there's no right or wrong. There's no actual answer to that. I don't know that necessarily to be true, but who knows?
What else was on that list?
Well, and not only what the value was at the time, but the value from my perspective could just potentially keep increasing, right? It's not that I didn't have the perspective, and I still don't have this perspective, that blogTO has reached peak value. I think blogTO is going to continue to be worth more over time. So again, it's part of, it was I don't know what to tell you. It was like a bit of a tricky decision, and I was torn. And it wasn't just all about, I've been focusing a lot on sort of the money aspect of it, but there's so many other considerations, like what is, this was done, again, this was all kind of like done like in confidence, non-disclosure, all this kind of stuff. So I didn't have the luxury of talking to my team about it and being like, what do you think? And are they going to be happy kind of being part of a larger organization? And what does this mean for the future? And like, is this going to change the strategy? Or like, is this going to be, which is a positive thing, like actually like present like some new opportunities and provide additional resources and all this sort of stuff. So there was all those considerations, but there's no going back. Like the point is like, I made the decision, and I could say today, that was a great decision. Or I could second guess it and go, maybe I shouldn't have done it. It doesn't matter. I'm not even going to play that game, because the decision was made. I sold the business, and that's it.
First of all, what you sold for is public information. So you sold for 15 million. And as we discussed earlier, you had no investors, so you were probably majority holder. What amount of that finally ends up with the founder in like these kind of situations?
You're right. There's taxes and everything in this country, right? Yeah. So that's public information, right? You can just Google to see like, what the capital gains tax is, all this sort of tax laws and stuff. So you are correct. It's widely available information that the business sold for 15 million. Zoomer Media was a public company at the time. It was in their financial statements. It was reported on by the media. So we're not breaking any news here saying that the company sold for $15 million Canadian. But yeah, absolutely. There's taxes that need to be paid on that. There's lawyers' fees that need to be paid to like put together the deal and all the sort of like documents and all that kind of stuff. There's accounting fees that need to be paid. So there's lots of money that kind of comes off that total. I don't have like a number to give you, but yeah.
And then I think because I was also reading like, again, just some general stuff like when you sell your first business, just like, when you sell your primary residence, you don't have a capital gains on that.
Yeah, it's not the whole thing. I think the first 5 million, there's no capital gains on. So again, don't quote me on this, because this is why I have like accountants to do this sort of work. Yeah. So I believe the first 5 million of capital gains is not taxable, and then everything after it is.
Was it all worth it? Would you go back and do it all over again?
Again, I wasn't looking to sell this business ever. Like the day I started it, I definitely had an idea of like how I could make this business work and how I could grow, make it a business and grow revenue, grow audience, all that sort of stuff. But I never, and you're just gonna have to take my word for this, I was never looking for an exit strategy, and I was never had a value that I was like aiming for. I was never like, oh, I want to grow this to like a $50 million company or something like that. I just wanted to grow it. Like I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't running the business to maximize revenue anyway. I was more interested in just the business itself being viable, successful, and just like being influential and having sort of, this large audience that loved, that the brand and, product resonated with. Like that was kind of my main motivation. And I think like most founders, I mean, I would advise if there's any founders sort of listening to this or prospective, entrepreneurs, I mean, you have to be passionate about what you're building and the industry that you're in. So that suited me to a T. So I loved, again, I worked long hours and there were challenges along the way and again, a lot of other things. But at the end of the day, like, do I love working in the media industry? Absolutely. Do I love the challenges that come in the problem solving that you have to deal with in any industry? Yeah, absolutely. I like doing that. It sort of keeps me motivated and engaged. And I think in particular with media, because I mean, all industries obviously evolve, but like some more than others. And as we talked about before, there's been a number of major changes, technology changes, I guess, primarily over the last, 15 to 20 years that have really just completely transformed the media industry a number of different times. And that is also an intellectual challenge and a business challenge, and that again keeps it interesting, right? If it was, if nothing changed and it was just stagnant, I may have got bored with it, to be honest. But blogTO was never boring, and our community was never boring. They always kept us on our toes, and they always had high expectations, and still have high expectations for what blogTO is and what blogTO does. And you also want to uphold that, right? You want to kind of step up to the plate and live up to those expectations.
Without getting into like the weeds of it, like what's the big overarching reason you think you got fired? Obviously can't share the details of it.
I would say that, when a founder, and this applies not just to my case, I think when a founder sells a company to someone else, you're essentially you're relinquishing control. You have to understand that. It then becomes someone else's company, and they may still entrust you to run it and make decisions and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not yours anymore. It's someone else's. And the deal that you make when you sell a company is you then have to let someone else do with it what they want, and they get to run it the way they want because they own it. And that's totally fair. That's the deal that I made. And so that's what's happening. And, they get to make choices who they want to run it, including, whether they want me there or not. And that's totally fair. That's their choice to make. What I will say is that I think I did a lot of great things at that company after I sold it. I might have mentioned earlier that I continued to, I didn't slack on my work ethic. I continued to work as hard as when I did, the first, 17 years. I wanted, even though I didn't, again, have necessarily that financial stake in the company anymore, I still definitely had an emotional stake in the brand, and I still had, the best interests of all the employees and staff, in mind, and wanted them to, do whatever I could to make them successful, and to, again, leverage some of the resources that were provided by Zoomer to, again, do more things and more interesting things with blogTO. So I think we did a lot of great work. I think I did a lot of great work working with the team there. They were challenging times, no doubt. I mean, the media industry in Canada is challenging at best right now, particularly for, digital media companies. And the reason for that is primarily the Online News Act, otherwise referred to as C-18, and that's the reason why you can't get news on your Facebook feed anymore, you can't get news on Instagram anymore. For a brand like blogTO and other digital native brands, I mean, this was a major negative impact, both in terms of, not having access to that audience anymore, an audience that we spent years building up and engaging, but also the revenue that we drove and the distribution that we drove from those platforms. So I would say the media industry has been challenging since I sold the business, but I would also say that I think we navigated it as well as we could have.
Fair enough. So now I do this one activity with all my guests, and it's a book called, I'll put it on the screen. It's called 3001 Questions All About Me. I'm going to give it to you. You just pick a random question from this book, read it out loud so the audience can hear it, and then you just answer it.
All right, so I'm gonna have to put on my glasses for this one because I'm blind.
And you have to say out the number before you open the book.
Oh, okay. So I don't know. Go with 24. What's my favorite place on earth? Well, as a founder of blogTO, I think it would be, you know, off-brand, not to say Toronto for this one.
There you go. We'll go with Toronto then. Tim, this was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed learning about the early days of blogTO, sort of the middle part and sort of where it ended. And then the beauty of it all is you started by getting fired and getting a severance. And then you ended it and closed the book by getting fired and getting a severance. Any final words for the audience?
Well, Paul, I just appreciate your interest and your time. And I know that you've been trying to get me in this chair for a little while. So I'm glad we could finally make it happen. And hopefully I was able to shed some light on some of the questions that you had. And hopefully for everyone who spent the time watching this video or listening to it, that maybe they learned something or got something out of it as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot for people to unpack. This was great.
Thank you.